in the heart of medieval Burgundy, whispers traveled through the gilded halls like an unseen miasma. They spoke of decline, of a vibrant court suddenly burdened by unexplained fatigue. And at the epicenter of these unsettling rumors was the man himself, the king. He was failing to maintain his customary vigor, afflicted instead by fits that struck him precisely at twilight. The opulence of the royal residence only seemed to amplify the surrounding anxieties. Attendants exchanged glances fraught with worry and intrigue, their hushed tones echoing off polished marble. To speak openly of a king's infirmity was treason. To speculate on its cause was near enough. The court physicians, men vested with both authority and profound mystery, were called in as if by decree. They approached the royal malady with a blend of classical medicine, astrological prognostication, and sheer guesswork. Their diagnosis offered no concrete comfort, merely vague assurances that the king's humors needed rebalancing. But the pattern of his decline was too precise to be mere humoral imbalance. His episodes always materialized during the liminal hours, when the sun dipped toward the horizon and shadows elongated across the mosaic floors. A low-ranking attendant, whose name passed into local lore with a mixture of pity and suspicion, became the reluctant chronicler of the royal struggle. He was not an investigator by trade, but rather a man tasked with serving, and therefore privy to the most intimate details of royal weakness. Day after day, he watched the king retreat into bouts of unnatural sleep, fits that bordered on oblivion. These were not the deep, restorative slumbers of health. They were punctuated cessations, sudden arrests of consciousness, followed by alarming periods of profound grogginess. The whispers began to solidify from worry into something far more sinister. Was this illness or intervention? Was it a failing body, susceptible to age and stress? Or was there an external influence at play? The court, always keenly attuned to power dynamics, saw not just sickness, but vulnerability. If the king could be subdued so reliably by a mere change of light, then his power itself was negotiable. The royal physicians, grappling with symptoms they could neither categorize nor cure, began experimenting in secret. Their remedies became increasingly complex, moving far beyond simple herbal poultices or bloodletting rituals. They sought compounds that could mandate rest, draughts potent enough to quell the turmoil of a sovereign mind, but also carrying inherent risk. The necessity arose not simply for medicine, but for chemical control. The nature of these purported cures was shrouded in impenetrable jargon. Spices were mixed with root extracts. Mineral salts found themselves combined with animal preparations. Yet, beneath the Baroque titles and complex prescriptions lay a growing suspicion that what they administered to ensure slumber might be poisoning, merely disguised as profound medicine. The very act of achieving rest had become suspect. It suggested an enforced tranquility, one dictated not by natural wellness, but by chemical mandate. The investigation into the king's twilight struggles grew deeper and darker. Those closest to him noticed that after his fits subsided, he rarely retained a true, unfiltered memory of the episodes. He would awaken disoriented, plagued by fragmented images, a scent too sweet, a color too deep, a crushing weightlessness pervading his last conscious thoughts. It was as if someone had dipped his consciousness into a fog, leaving only the damp residue on the surface. The question, therefore, ceased to be merely medical and became profoundly political. Who controlled the draft? And more crucially, why was this chemical assurance of sleep deemed necessary for the physical continuation of the empire itself? The answer hung heavy in the air of the palace, a breath of narcotic vapor, hinting at a dangerous blend of pharmacology and absolute power. This initial scandal did not just reveal a king's malaise, it exposed the dark pharmacopoeia that lay at the very heart of medieval aristocratic control, laying bare the line between healing science and debilitating poison. Driven by mounting suspicion, the pursuit of truth led our investigator deep into the most secretive corners of the royal court, the domain of the apothecary. This was not merely a collection of herbs and remedies. It was a chemical vault, a silent repository of oblivion. We gained access, finally, to chambers steeped in the pungent, unsettling aroma of forgotten science. The air within was thick with powdered root bark and dried petals, carrying a scent that spoke equally of healing promise and profound danger. Every jar, every vial, seemed to hold a whisper of manufactured slumber. The inventory was terrifying. Labels marked specimens we barely recognize by name. Atropa belladonna, the deadly nightshade, mandragora root, whispered to possess potent soporific magic. Residue labeled simply as opium. These substances were not relegated to peasant remedies. They were treated with a reverence and cost reserved only for the highest nobility. The simple act of accessing this collection suggested that rest was a commodity controlled by those who could most easily manipulate the minds of men. The focus quickly narrowed, drawn inexorably toward a single ledger, tucked away beneath stacks of dubious tinctures. This account book detailed prescriptions and payments, entries that spoke volumes about the sleeping habits, or lack thereof, of the elite class. The descriptions were coded, speaking not in terms of aches or fevers, but in specific mandates for deep repose or mandated tranquility. It suggested a level of chemical control over noble behavior previously unimaginable. The implication was chilling, that powerful sedatives and potent narcotics had become standard accessories to high society life. The aristocratic pursuit of leisure and pleasure now seemed chemically supported. We began to understand the sheer breadth of this dangerous inventory. From foxglove, potent enough to induce cardiac arrest, if dosed incorrectly, came preparations for calming erratic tempers. There were also mixtures utilizing various alkaloids, substances that could lull a person into an unnatural depth of sleep, while simultaneously altering their consciousness in profound ways. The apothecary's shelves functioned as a testament to man's desperate ingenuity in conquering wakefulness. If the goal was peace, then chemistry offered dozens of dangerous avenues toward it. The wealthy, who lived lives of overwhelming luxury and perpetual political tension, were perhaps the first and most demanding clients for these chemical solutions. Their boredom, their ambition, and their ceaseless anxiety demanded a reliable curtain to fall upon their days. The drugs found here suggested not mere medicine, but lifestyle management on a powerful level. Certain concoctions weren't meant just to help sleep. They were designed to ensure compliance, to quiet dissenting thoughts, and perhaps even to dull the sharpness of inconvenient memories. The sheer potency documented in this ledger painted a grim picture that, for the upper echelons of society, rest was not restorative, it was chemical maintenance. This inventory signaled a systemic vulnerability within the very fabric of the noble court. Slumber, that most fundamental human need, had been commercialized and chemically controlled. The poison wasn't always an attack. Sometimes it was merely mandated comfort. But whether for pleasure or political necessity, the danger remained constant, humming beneath the surface of those luxurious, drug-induced naps. This dangerous inventory provided not just a list of poisons, but a blueprint for control, mapping out how easily peace could be sold and dictated from behind locked oak doors. As the investigation deepens, the focus narrows from mere poisoning to a systematic commodification of rest itself. Sleep, once seen as a natural cycle governed by biology and exhaustion, became, in high society, another luxury item, a controlled commodity, bought and sold through potent botanical agents. The true power lay not in the draughts themselves, but in the ability to mandate them. To control sleep was to control consciousness. It was the ultimate tool of social management. The air in these wealthy enclaves carried a thick, almost intoxicating perfume, a blend of exotic oils and processed herbs that masked the underlying chemical truth. The family, whose estate served as our current locus, had adopted a regimen so profound it bordered on chemically mandated sedation. This was not simple herbal tea. This was pharmaceutical architecture built upon nature's most potent poisons. The evening arrived cloaked in a preternaturally dense fog that seemed to seep from the cobblestones and mingle with the stagnant air. It hung over the estate grounds, muffling sounds and dulling edges, preparing the populace for a profound descent into unconsciousness. Tonight was dictated by decree a powerful, yet vaguely described sleep tonic, mandated by local ordinance, designed to quell any hint of restless activity or intellectual unrest amongst the merchant class. The effect began subtly. A languid warmth spread through the periphery of vision, a creeping lethargy that felt less like natural tiredness and more like an external force drawing breath from the lungs. The residents, used to such mandated tranquility, did not resist. They simply succumbed. They sank into an unnaturally deep slumber, their forms losing tension, their breathing smoothing out into hypnotic rhythms. But one servant remained awake. He was tasked with simple oversight, a guard of shadows and silence. As the rest of the household faded away, something unsettling occurred. It began with fleeting movements, tiny tremors in the limbs that suggested not muscle fatigue, but deep chemical processing. Then came the hallucinations. The sleepers' faces retained their peaceful masks, yet subtle changes played out around them. A hand might twitch, as if grasping an object that wasn't there. A mouth might settle into a faint, unsettling smile, suggesting dreams woven from dangerous compounds. The servant watched in morbid disbelief, realizing that this slumber was not merely deep. It was chemically mediated, forcing the mind to process visions under duress. The vividness of these unconscious dramas suggested that the sleep aids had crossed the threshold from mere soporifics into potent psychoactives, inviting a carnival of false realities. This witnessing changed everything for our investigation. If the elite could be put to sleep through ritual and habit, it meant they were entirely dependent on the chemical means provided. The dreams, visible even in their absence, painted a picture not of rest, but of profound intellectual dulling, a manufactured peace that dulled wit as surely as it dimmed the eyes. The next day found the estate bathed in an unsettling, premature sunlight, too bright for true morning. The servants moved through the halls with a hushed reverence, their faces marked by exhaustion that transcended simple lack of sleep. It was the fatigue of chemically altered existence. The investigation shifted its focus from merely identifying poisons to understanding control mechanisms. How deeply could society be managed when its most critical functions, waking thought and decisive action, could be suspended by a mere draft? The sheer luxury of this manufactured slumber was staggering. To afford such an undisturbed night was not just wealth. It indicated one's standing within a carefully controlled social hierarchy. The deepest sleep was reserved for those who could petition or pay the authorities to render them unconscious, a commodity only available in specialized doses. We began compiling detailed notes on the common ingredients used across various aristocratic households. Compounds involving foxglove were ubiquitous, promising deep sedation with a terrifyingly narrow margin between rest and cardiac arrest. Opium remained the cornerstone of guaranteed oblivion, its scent forever linked to mandated peace. But increasingly prominent in the ledgers were mentions of other volatile alkaloids, compounds that promised not just sleep, but a level of sensory alteration rarely before recorded. The apothecary's records confirmed these fears. It wasn't just about making people pass out. It was about tailoring the depth and duration of the blackout. Some prescriptions guaranteed mere restful repose, sufficient to allow one to forget the day's anxieties, while others, the deeply alarming ones, promised a period of profound, almost catatonic suspension. This marked a terrifying evolution in pharmacopoeia. From curing illness to preemptively regulating civil life, the true scale of this control became evident when we examined court minutes alongside physicians' logs. The records suggested that during times of political fragility or economic instability, the supply and administration of these sedatives would inexplicably increase. It was a systemic prophylactic against dissent. A merchant facing ruin could be given enough rest to forget his debts. A politically inconvenient noble could simply be rendered too drowsy to make an accusation. The investigation pressed deeper into the origins of certain unique mixtures, specifically those containing processed cocaine alkaloids, which were becoming increasingly popular with the wealthy. These drugs promised not just deep sleep, but vibrant, chemically enhanced dreams, a dangerous novelty that allowed the user to feel temporarily detached from their dreary, politically unstable reality, offering an illusion of liberation. The implications were stark. By medicating slumber itself, the ruling class created a dependency. They were not merely selling medicine, they were dispensing neurological shackles. Those who relied on these mandatory dreams found themselves losing critical edges, the spark of unpredictable thought, the grit required for struggle, the necessary discomfort that fuels change and revolution. The realization hit with chilling clarity. The pursuit of flawless sleep was fueling a crisis of human vitality. By ensuring perpetual repose through chemical means, society was slowly accepting a deeper level of intellectual atrophy. The most dangerous drug wasn't the one that killed quickly. It was the one that allowed people to wake up feeling perfectly rested, yet fundamentally dulled, subtly compliant, and utterly dependent. We have journeyed through the opulence of court intrigue, examining how slumber itself became a commodity, traded in secretive apothecaries, and mandated by decree. From potent draughts designed to keep an emperor compliant, we saw the systemic use of alkaloids, substances that promised oblivion while enforcing absolute control. The seduction of deep rest was absolute. It held the promise of forgetting, of a temporary escape from the brutal exigencies of life in the great halls of power. But when sleep becomes chemically regulated, it loses its natural sanctity. It becomes merely another tool of the powerful. If drugs controlled the body's deepest rhythm, then even art and expression could become suspect instruments of control. The court itself became a crucible where every utterance, every melody, risked carrying a dangerous dose of compliance. This suspicion focused on those who communicated the ethereal, the bards, the poets, the troubadours. The next subject under intense scrutiny was a disgraced troubadour, a man whose very trade hinged on capturing the fleeting beauty of consciousness, of passion, of struggle, of wakefulness. Yet, his work had begun to acquire an unnatural, soporific quality. He claimed that every poem he crafted concerning the theme of sleep seemed inexplicably hypnotic, dragging its listeners into a state of drowsy compliance. It was as if his verse itself contained powdered lethargy. The court physician, already paranoid from years of managing the politically charged mystery of enforced slumber, reacted with profound alarm. He did not attribute this to natural artistic evolution or the mere passage of time. He suspected deliberate chemical sabotage. His gaze lingered on the troubadour's lute, a finely carved instrument that had accompanied so many whispered secrets and soaring romances. The physician's suspicion escalated to the theory that the music itself was compromised. He posited that Minut's soporific agents, dustings of belladonna, or residue from opium, were being subtly administered through the strings, perhaps mixed into the wood of the instrument, ensuring that every performance wasn't just art, but a mandated sedative. The troubadour, acutely aware of the dangers surrounding his craft, was trapped in a precarious position. His voice, once celebrated for its vibrancy and dramatic flair, now echoed with accusations. He maintained his innocence, arguing that the accuser's fear had poisoned their perception of reality. But the seeds of doubt were planted by the weight of law and desperate political necessity. The investigation pressed on, moving away from the grand drama of the royal court and into the intimate sphere of healing. The focus shifted to local practitioners, the herbalists and healers who operated outside the watchful eyes of the chief physician. They represented a more raw, dangerous source of knowledge, remedies drawn directly from forest floor and forgotten texts. One such healer was called upon by an aristocratic family struggling with persistent restlessness, form of insomnia that seemed to mirror larger societal unease. The healer, knowledgeable in obscure, powerful botanicals, attempted to formulate a cure using deeply potent herbs. These concoctions were not necessarily poisons. They were simply immensely strong medicinal agents, often bordering on the fatal. The session was fraught with tension, a mixture of hope and sheer chemical risk. As the poor noble consumed the carefully mixed draughts, a potent cocktail combining roots, leaves, and unknown tinctures, the intended effect should have been a deep, restorative peace. But instead, in a dramatic escalation that shattered the calm atmosphere, the noble suddenly convulsed. The initial goal of peaceful slumber had failed spectacularly, revealing the volatile nature of uncontrolled doses. The episode served as a grim revelation. The fine line between profound medicinal aid and outright toxic overdose was terrifyingly thin. The failure was not just medical, it highlighted the inherent danger in treating human consciousness with botanical extremes. It demonstrated that even attempts at natural healing could, if unchecked, tip an individual from deep rest into sheer physical peril. These escalating incidents, from the chemically induced naps of the elite to the failed herbal cures, forced a broader confrontation regarding the nature of controlled sleep. The investigation broadened its scope, moving into the halls of civil justice, where magistrates and city leaders debated the ethical boundaries of medicinal intervention. Here, in a darkened hall filled with solemn men in robes, the debate was no longer framed as one of healing or mere indulgence. It became an argument over systemic power. The debate centered on the legal use of sleep aids for the populace. Critics argued that mandatory sedation, even if framed under benevolent laws intended to curb public disorder and guarantee rest for the working poor, constituted nothing less than chemical control. A guildsman, representing a class more accustomed to street protest and volatile labor action than hushed chambers of law, rose to challenge the established order. He presented evidence suggesting a devastating truth: that rest was increasingly being treated not as a natural requirement for human flourishing, but merely as a legal instrument designed to enforce compliance and silence growing dissent. To mandate slumber was to negate free will. The alarm sounded within the governing body chambers. The inherent danger of chemically managed peace was laid bare before all assembled. This escalating crisis pushed the investigation further into the hidden veins of the city, the underground economy, where necessity overcame legality. The story tracked the investigator through a dark, shadowy black market operation. Here, outside the purview of law or official medicine, specialists operated as highly sophisticated chemists. They were engaged in the volatile trade of crystallized oblivion. These were not benign herbal teas. They were pure alkaloids and finely powdered agents of slumber, crystallized death, refined for profit. The commodities traded here were the ultimate promises: absolute peace. Buyers were not kings concerned with maintaining a courtly facade, but desperate individuals, merchants facing ruin, laborers enduring brutal toil, thinkers overwhelmed by thought, all willing to risk their very lives for just one night without anxiety, worry, or wakeful consequence. The weight of this clandestine commerce culminated at the apex of high society, a grand royal banquet. This was not a covert meeting. It was an orchestrated display of power and plenty. The centerpiece of the suspense focused on the master apothecary, who stood as the linchpin, the custodian of all these dangerous knowledge and potent compounds. Confrontation finally arrived, sharp and inevitable, cornering him within the glow of opulent chandeliers. A tense standoff ensued amid polite whispers and forced gaiety. Accusations flew of poisoning, of compliance, of controlling minds through mandated rest. The master apothecary remained shielded by the layers of tradition and necessary discretion that guarded the most powerful secrets. Then came a moment of sickening realization. As a centerpiece drink, potent and seemingly harmless, was passed around the assembled elite, it became chillingly obvious to the protagonist. Every single patron, from the highest noble to the most influential merchant, had been secretly dosed with an exceptionally powerful sedative of unknown origin. The drug worked not just on the body, but seemed designed to neutralize critical thought, softening the edges of resistance and making compliant sleep the only palatable outcome. The truth was a corrosive fog, descending over the banquet hall, promising nothing more than surrender to slumber. The ultimate confrontation demanded an act of profound internal will, a refusal to succumb to the chemically engineered calm. It was here that the protagonist, battered by the evidence and exhausted by the relentless march of scientific suspicion, managed to muster enough resistance to resist the final, overarching wave of chemical influence. As the potent sleeping fog finally began to lift over the assembled court, something monumental became horribly clear. The price paid for this enforced peace was devastating. It was not merely a state of temporary unconsciousness. It represented a deep physical decay and an intellectual dulling among those whose lives had become overly reliant on perpetually drug-induced tranquility. They had exchanged the jagged clarity of conscious life for the velvet anesthetic of mandated slumber, and the cost was irrevocably steep. This confrontation did not end the mystery of poisoned peace, but it marked a critical turning point, shifting the focus from mere accusation to consequence, forcing society to grapple with the terrifying vulnerability of the sleeping mind. In an age of unchecked chemical power, the whispers of the court had been replaced by hushed exchanges in the cramped, earthy corners of local healing practices, where royal courts dealt in rarefied alkaloids and state-mandated doses. The desperation for sleep found a different outlet: the local healer. Ilara, an herbalist with hands stained by countless remedies, operated on the fringes of community life. She was not concerned with political control, but with alleviating acute suffering, the insomnia of the poor, or perhaps the restlessness bred by fear and poverty itself. Our investigation led us to observe one such consultation. The patient was a restless aristocrat whose lineage spoke of privilege, yet whose nights were plagued by an erratic, painful inability to settle. He had come not for diagnosis, but for oblivion. Ilara's chamber smelled richly of dried herbs, the pungent sharpness of thyme, the sickly sweetness of crushed petals, and the deep, metallic undertone that always suggested potent chemical compounds. The process was steeped in tradition, a blend of genuine restorative folk remedies and dangerously obscure botanical knowledge. She spoke of harmonies between roots and liquids, suggesting cures derived from nature's most powerful excesses. The treatments were elaborate mixtures, poultices pressed against the pulse points, teas brewed with leaves gathered only at midnight, and draughts that tasted faintly bitter, like old wine mixed with earth. As we watched, Alara prepared a potent blend for the noble man. Her movements were practiced, almost ritualistic. She employed herbs known to soothe the nerves. Valerian root was among them, its aroma cloying and heavy. But beneath the veneer of gentle sedation lay ingredients far more volatile. These included foxglove, whose cardiac effects had long been misunderstood by charlatans, blended with other unknowns drawn from the deepest woods, plants that held both profound restfulness and lethal potential in equal measure. The air in the small room thickened with a drowsy warmth. The noble man consumed the elixir slowly, his eyelids growing heavy against their will. It was clearly effective. The initial agitation subsided quickly, replaced by a languid surrender. For a time, it seemed restorative, a deep and undeniable peace settling over him, mimicking the mandated slumber observed in high society. Yet, there were subtle irregularities in the draughts offered here, improvisational mixes that lacked the structured secrecy of the royal court. They were mixtures born of necessity, not of calculated control. The culmination came when Alara administered a final preparation, one meant to induce a profound, dreamless slumber. The mixture was almost overwhelmingly potent, combining multiple soporific agents in an untested combination. The noble man drank it down entirely. His breathing deepened almost instantly, his muscles slackening into unresisted weight. What followed was not rest, but catastrophe. The deep, forced calm suddenly fractured. With a strained gasp, the aristocrat began to convulse. It was a violent, unpredictable reaction, far surpassing mere sleep-induced twitching. His body arched against its will, limbs jerking, as if battling an unseen force. Alara, faced with this raw biological response, reacted poorly, her careful control unraveling under the weight of unexpected toxicity. The chaos erupted in that small chamber, a stark contrast to the controlled decay witnessed in the opulence of the palace. The noble man was no longer merely sleeping. He was fighting a chemically induced crisis, his system overwhelmed by the synergistic overdose of roots and potent liquids. His convulsions were a terrible warning, a testament to how dangerously unpredictable nature's pharmacy could be when cornered by desperation and ill-guided skill. The failed seance exposed a fundamental truth. While both the royal decree and the local healer aimed for one goal, deep, undeniable slumber, their methods varied wildly in their degree of dangerous control. The elite used potent agents like cocaine or purified alkaloids, ensuring predictable dosage and systematic compliance, making the sedation an extension of state power. But here, among the common folk, remedies were often haphazardly compounded, mixing genuinely helpful tinctures with fatally unbalanced concoctions. The immediate danger to the noble man underscored that every attempt to medicate sleep carried a high cost. The powerful sedatives, whether delivered through sophisticated court intrigue or humble herbal preparation, did not simply switch off consciousness. They manipulated life itself, blurring the line between therapeutic relief and biological poison. This chaotic episode was not just an unfortunate accident. It was a critical failure in understanding the intricate chemistry of human repose, revealing that chemical sleep, regardless of source, always carried the intrinsic threat of systemic overload and acute danger. The quiet severity of the magistrate's hall was oppressive, thick with unvoiced accusations and the dry scent of old parchment. This was not a courtroom seeking justice for crime. It was a council attempting to legislate sleep itself. Here, amidst polished oak tables and murmuring civic debate, the commodification of slumber was being debated as if it were merely another grain tax or market tariff. The air tasted metallic with institutional anxiety, a collective discussion centered on poor citizens, the laborers, the artisans, those whose lives required constant toil, but whose constitutions were perpetually taxed by the demands of survival. They spoke of mandated rest, mandatory quiet hours enforced not by law, but by chemically induced slumber. These weren't natural remedies. They were potent cocktails of oblivion, prescribed under the guise of public health and civic order. Suddenly, a man rose from the gathered ranks. He was not a magistrate nor a physician, but a guildsman, a weaver perhaps, or stonemason, someone who lived by calloused hands and visible labor. His demeanor was defiant, his worn coat seeming too rugged for such polished surroundings. He approached the central table with an object wrapped in stained linen, a small ledger book, far heavier than its size suggested. He did not plead, he presented evidence. The guildsman's argument painted a damning picture of modern governance. That peace was no longer earned through toil and free will, but rather purchased via chemical compliance. He argued forcefully that the official endorsement of sleep aids, especially for those without means to purchase private remedies, was nothing less than a systemic tool of control. It was a way to guarantee quiescence in the masses, ensuring that discontent could be chemically pacified before it had the chance to gather force, much less articulate its grievances. The magistrate, initially skeptical and inclined toward pragmatic dismissal, visibly faltered under the weight of the evidence presented. The guildsman's detailed accounts painted a disturbing pattern. Localized shortages coinciding exactly with periods of brewing dissent, records noting mandatory compliance rest in neighborhoods that had recently demonstrated unrest, and descriptions of civic order being maintained not through patrolling guards, but through administered doses of sedation. The accusation, therefore, was profound. The question before the hall was whether mandated slumber for the populace constituted medicine or merely a highly sophisticated form of legal bondage, a state-sanctioned chemical mandate designed to enforce obedience and silence potential rebellion. As the argument spiraled through the debate, touching upon ancient precedents and modern medicinal practices, the sheer paranoia inherent in the system became glaringly apparent. If rest itself could be criminalized or mandated by decree, then human consciousness itself was under state purview. The concept of spontaneous wakefulness, of simply being awake, arguing, or dreaming, a dangerous thought, became an act requiring judicial review. The whispers grew louder, not of accusation, but of fear. Fear that if the governing class could regulate the onset and depth of sleep, they held dominion over memory, critical thought, and ultimately the very spirit of resistance. The poor were being taught a dangerous dependency, that their state of deepest repose required an external chemical agent to be achieved. The implications were staggering. By treating slumber as a resource to be managed, society had not merely improved public health, it had fundamentally altered the nature of civil liberty. If you could reliably manufacture docility, what value did independent thought hold? This legal review of sleep was less about welfare and more about perpetual pharmaceutical compliance. The air in the great hall seemed to thin, leaving only the bitter clarity of intellectual terror. But control is never confined to the solemnity of law. Even as the magistrates struggled with the moral weight of the guildsman's accusations, whispers suggested a deeper rot, a black market operating just beyond the reach of official decrees. The true pharmaceutical exchange was not happening in this hall. It flourished in shadows, in clandestine alleys and hidden workshops, where desperation provided its own law, richer and far more lethal than any magistrate's writ. After the revelations of the magistrate's hall, where the tenuous lines between medicine and systemic control were shredded in public debate, the investigation led to a darker underbelly. The formal halls of law could not contain the demand for oblivion. It had simply slipped beneath them. Following whispers of whispered transactions and coded movements among the city's poorest quarters, we tracked the investigation into the labyrinthine streets that breathed only suspicion and shadowed deals. This was the heart of the black market, a realm where survival valued temporary forgetfulness above all else. Here, the rules of polite society ceased to exist. The sophisticated rituals of aristocratic sedation were replaced by raw desperation. It was not about maintaining political order for the crown. It was about simple escape, a momentary void from hunger, fear, or insurmountable debt. Our search led us through hidden apothecaries that operated less like pharmacies and more like clandestine laboratories. These were places where medicinal precision gave way to dangerous experimentation. The dealers here did not sell cures. They traded crystallized moments of nothingness. The goods displayed were potent alkaloids, substances refined far past the point of traditional herbalism. They spoke in hushed tones of powders that could guarantee a night free from waking consciousness, offering peace measured out by weight and cost. These chemists operated with unnerving scientific confidence, capable of separating minute quantities of exquisite toxicity. The ledger book detailing high society rest prescriptions felt distant now. This trade was primal, stripped bare of aristocratic pretense. It catered to the jittery craftsman who needed simply hours to pass, to the laborer whose exhaustion demanded chemical enforcement, and most tragically, to the heartbroken soul seeking a swift erasure of memory. The true commodity here, we realized, was not rest itself, but reliable control over consciousness. These shadowy chemists were masters of purification, taking volatile jungle roots and deadly foxglove leaves, refining them into crystalline structures that held pure sedative power. They understood chemistry better than the court physicians. They did not merely administer a blend, they engineered oblivion. Our presence was noted, but our authority remained outside their purview. The black market viewed us as an anomaly, a mere distraction from the necessary exchange of pain for temporary peace. We observed transactions that chilled the blood, small handfuls of dust exchanging hands for gold coins and whispered promises. It was an economy built on fatigue and terror. The chemical cocktail available was staggeringly diverse. Alongside the well-known opiate residues, there were experimental blends involving local anesthetic derivatives and highly potent hallucinogenic agents, all packaged under the guise of a sleep draft. This marketplace represented the uncontrolled scientific potential of desperation, where quality control was non-existent, and side effects were often fatal. We found specialized dealers who dealt not in bulk quantities, but in tailored solutions. They could measure out an exact duration of unconsciousness, a 3-hour plateau for a night watchman, a full 10-hour void for the destitute farmer. These formulas varied wildly, betraying either the crude efficiency of necessity or the unsettling finesse of high-grade alchemy. The revelations from this underground trade were terrifying in their implications. It showed that the need for chemically induced slumber was not confined to royal courts battling political instability. It was woven into the very fabric of the city's desperate existence. Life, when overwhelming, demanded artificial stasis. The drugs were a societal bandage covering wounds that formal medicine could not reach. The investigation moved deeper, past mere exchange, and into the sources of these poisons. We encountered suppliers who traded in raw, untainted alkaloids, materials that should have remained in the wild swamps or deep mountain caves. These weren't processed goods. They were elemental oblivion waiting to be harvested. The scale suggested a network far larger than any simple city market, hinting at entire clandestine agricultural operations dedicated solely to maximizing toxic yield. This black market was not just a point of commerce. It was an indictment of the surrounding society. It pointed to the exhaustion of legitimate relief. When the established pharmaceutical avenues, the regulated apothecary shelves, failed or were deemed too expensive for the majority, people turned to those who dealt in unbridled potency. The profound takeaway from this hidden world is that while political control sought to manage sleep through mandated authority, economic desperation led to a decentralized market of individual risk. The poor bought their dreams from unknown hands, trading stability and long-term health for immediate relief. They were the true consumers of chemically mediated peace, paying with more than just currency. The sheer potency on display forced us to confront the reality that the sedation required by high society was merely an echo of a deeper, universal need, a desperate desire to simply stop thinking. This trade proved that the search for sleep was inseparable from the acquisition of specialized poisons, marking it not as a medical issue, but as a profound social and chemical epidemic. The city's whispers had led them to the precipice of power, a place where political ambition mixed with deadly botany. The grand dinner was not merely an event. It was a stage for control. Every gilded chair and crystal decanter represented a point of potential influence, each guest a variable in a deeply dangerous equation. They gathered under the pretense of celebration, a performance of normalcy following weeks of investigation into engineered sleep and mandated oblivion. The air itself felt heavy, thick with expensive perfumes and unspoken secrets, yet beneath it all lay the insidious scent of potent chemicals, the promise of manufactured ease. The protagonist knew this was not a casual gathering. It was a controlled experiment designed for one purpose: assimilation. Their presence here was an anomaly, a disruption in the calculated flow of power that sought to neutralize them with perfect repose. They watched the assembled aristocracy, faces masks of practiced gaiety, eyes carrying the faint, dull glaze of those accustomed to perpetual sedation, the chemical comfort that dulled intellect and quieted dissent. The suspicion finally crystallized around the master apothecary. This man, once an expert in restorative tonics, now stood accused of orchestrating a societal anesthetic. He was not just a seller of drugs. He was a custodian of political inertia, ensuring that those who governed remained docile and compliant through carefully measured doses of oblivion. The tension within the hall became almost audible. A taut wire stretched between suspicion and privilege. Accusations were murmured over clinking silverware and hushed laughter. Every glance seemed charged with accusation, yet nothing could be said openly. The powerful understood how to enforce silence as effectively as they enforced sleep itself. It was an elegant dance of mutual restraint, kept barely afloat by shared complicity in the drug trade that maintained their privileged stupor. Then, the central drama unfolded around a magnificent centerpiece wine vessel. Servants moved with meticulous grace, passing trays laden with delicacies and drinks. All eyes were drawn to this communal ritual, for it was through these conduits of consumption that the final poison would pass. The master apothecary seemed to take center stage, moving like a dark magician, guiding the collective intake. He smiled, a knowing, almost paternal expression, suggesting that true peace, the deepest, most enviable rest, required his specialized formula. The protagonist watched closely, recognizing the signature of lethal control in the man's movements. Every gesture was rehearsed for maximum effect, designed to convince the guests that what they were consuming was merely exquisite conviviality, a harmless elevation of mood rather than chemical subjugation. As the wine circulated, its color deep and inviting, an invisible wave of force seemed to emanate from it, a powerful, soporific fog, meticulously engineered. The effect began almost imperceptibly. First, a few guests displayed mild lethargy, leaning slightly into their companions. Then, the signs compounded. Conversation faltered mid-sentence. Elegant hand gestures became sluggish and heavy. The initial excitement of the meal curdled into an overwhelming drowsiness, a systemic inability to stay alert that bordered on hypnosis. It was not merely tiredness, it was chemical mandate. Every patron at this banquet was being secretly dosed, systematically moved toward an enforced slumber by means unknown, a cocktail of powerful sedatives designed for institutional control. The protagonist felt the creeping fog settle over their own senses, a pressure against the cortex that demanded surrender. Yet, years of meticulous preparation and observation allowed them to maintain a fragile wakefulness. They resisted the urge to slump, gripping the edge of their chair like an anchor in a deepening sea. It was a desperate struggle against biochemistry itself. The realization hit with sickening force. This slumber was not medicinal care. It was total disarmament. If all the pillars of power, the magistrates, the nobles, the wealthy patrons, could be simultaneously subdued by a single, controlled draft, then descent became structurally impossible. Wakefulness was an act of rebellion, and chemical ease was their ultimate weapon. The climax arrived not with a physical struggle, but with a terrible intellectual clarity amid sensory overload. The master apothecary's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of resistance. His grand display faltered. His sinister amusement met the unconquered gaze of the protagonist. Finally, in a moment of desperate confrontation near the center of the hall, the accusations spilled forth, raw and undeniable, painting him not as an herbalist, but as a chemical warden. The ensuing struggle for truth was fought with whispered evidence and damning exposure, shattering the illusion that their deep slumber was voluntary or restorative. The poisoning, they discovered, wasn't always administered in subtle draughts. Sometimes, the sedative effect simply revealed the underlying fragility of the system, the moment when chemical dependency reached its critical point of failure. Though the immediate physical threat lessened, the deepest consequence remained: the knowledge of systemic violation. The truth spilled out into the grand hall, leaving a residue of fear and intellectual exhaustion. Resistance was achieved, but at what cost? The victory tasted metallic, mingled with the bitter tang of chemical overexposure. They had resisted oblivion, yet the lasting damage, the pervasive weariness, the dullness behind the eyes, the memory of mandatory rest, suggested that the true price for fighting the sedative fog might be a permanent subtraction from the human spirit. The oppressive sweetness of the sedative fog finally broke, dissolving not into fresh air, but into a terrible clarity. For months, the court had lived suspended in an artificial twilight, their minds cushioned by chemical reprieve, and their memories softened by potent alkaloids. The revelation at the dinner, the public display of calculated dependence, hadn't just disrupted a single evening. It had cracked the fragile foundation upon which the entire social order rested. As the master apothecary's web of engineered slumber unwound, the true, staggering cost of perpetual rest became painfully apparent. We watched, immobilized by revelation and exhaustion, as the manufactured peace began to dissipate. The fog did not merely lift, it receded like a tide exposing ancient wreckage. With the mandatory sedation gone, the unnatural languor that had pervaded every noble bearing and measured movement suddenly faltered. People accustomed to chemically induced oblivion found themselves adrift in a harsh new reality, a state of wakefulness they were entirely unprepared for. The intellectual decay was immediate. The wit that had once sparked during lively debates now sputtered into silence. Arguments that moments before had been fiercely argued with passion and intelligence now dissolved into meaningless, hazy repetitions. A gentleman who minutes earlier had recited a dazzling ode to the resilience of statecraft now blinked slowly, his eyes unfocused, struggling to grasp the thread of his own thoughts. It was as if the sedatives had not just dulled the edge, they had begun to erode the very synaptic connections that fueled human brilliance. The protagonist, having fought through the chemically induced lethargy with sheer force of will and desperate observation, now stood Amidst this collective cognitive collapse, they saw it in the vacant stare of a minor official, struggling to reconcile his natural state of wakefulness with decades of pharmaceutical dependency. The ability to think sharply, to remember detail, or even to maintain an aggressive emotional pitch required tremendous effort that had been circumvented by the readily available chemical palliative. The courtiers were not simply tired, they were fundamentally dampened. Their resilience, their edge, the vital, dangerous spark of revolutionary thought, all seemed chemically neutralized. The system had perfected a control mechanism that required no visible chains or overt force. It only demanded perpetual sleep and an acceptance of oblivion in exchange for comfort. The fallout was corrosive. Whispers no longer centered on political maneuvers or territorial disputes. They focused instead on the sudden, aching need to simply be awake, to process reality without the chemical filter. Servants and lower-ranking members of the court, who had endured varying degrees of mandated dosage, showed signs of withdrawal, a desperate craving for natural struggle and unmedicated sensation. The ashes settling over that grand hall were not those of literal fire, but of wasted potential, the intellectual remnants of lives lived in perpetual, chemically mediated twilight. This was the ultimate consequence of systemic dependency, the exhaustion of the spirit, masked by the illusion of deep, restorative sleep. It became clear that for too long, the ruling powers had treated consciousness itself as a resource to be managed, regulated, and ultimately subdued through pharmacology. Sleep aids, once viewed purely as remedies for restless nights, were fundamentally tools of social disarmament. They suppressed not just physical agitation, but critical thought. They silenced skepticism before it could take root. The sheer depth of the systemic fraud was staggering. The apothecaries did not simply sell night's rest, they sold intellectual compliance. And the wealthy elite and the ruling class were its most devoted consumers, forever exchanging genuine selfhood for a guaranteed, drug-induced oblivion. Looking out over the stunned faces gathered in the hall, I understood that this poisoning was far more insidious than any single draught of poppy juice or venomous root could convey. It was an architecture of apathy, a structured life, where the effort required to simply be awake, and fully engaged felt insurmountable, while the drug-laced rest promised effortless continuance. The resistance fought here was not merely a physical escape from sedative vapors. It was a desperate reclaiming of mental sharpness, the arduous process of reacquainting oneself with the demanding texture of unmedicated reality. The fight for clarity became paramount, acknowledging that true freedom lay not in waking from slumber, but in sustaining the dangerous, exhilarating effort of being fully conscious, critically engaged, and perpetually alert to the subtle poison pervading every comfortable corner of their world. This newfound awareness was more painful than any fit. It was the crushing burden of a mind forced back into sharp focus after years spent floating on chemical currents. Years passed in the wake of that devastating revelry, years marked by a hesitant return to natural waking. The revelations exposed not just an apothecary's conspiracy, but a systemic vulnerability woven into the very fabric of society. The elite, those who had so casually wielded oblivion as a political weapon, faced a terrifying void. Sustained consciousness without chemical crutch. The immediate aftermath was marked by panic and retreat. Laws governing sedatives were hastily amended. Attempts were made to legitimize controlled pharmacological use for public safety. Yet the stain of that grand dinner lingered like a persistent, sickly fog over the court. The poison hadn't simply been an act. It had revealed a deeply ingrained societal addiction to effortless peace. The investigation continued not with arrests, but with observation, a slow, agonizing survey of the lingering effects. The intellectual dulling observed in those who survived the initial sedatives remained, shifting from acute poisoning to a chronic atrophy of the mind. Critical thought became an exhausting luxury, something savored only by the few who had learned to reject the promised depths of synthetic sleep. The kingdom was forced into a fragile equilibrium. On one hand, new medicinal regimens were quietly adopted, ostensibly designed for restful recovery. They claimed to manage insomnia and restlessness through controlled doses. Yet, history shows that even in rehabilitation, power structures find ways to monetize and thus control the most fundamental biological functions. The danger had simply mutated. The mandate of slumber hadn't been repealed, merely professionalized. The once wild black market trade of raw alkaloids did not vanish entirely. It burrowed deeper, adapting its distribution networks into more subtle forms of commerce. Now, oblivion was no longer sold in massive vats for royal consumption, but whispered through discreet channels, a highly specialized commodity sought by those who felt the pressure of maintaining a perpetually aware consciousness. The historian understood that the struggle had moved beyond the dramatic flourish of a single grand banquet. It was now embedded into daily life. The whispers surrounding sleep became less about outright sedation and more about optimization, efficiency, and pharmaceutical dependency. To be truly alert, to engage in radical thought, sometimes required a medicinal supplement itself, a depressing circular logic. The authorities found ways to repackage the danger. They introduced tonics for mental clarity or specialized elixirs, guaranteeing restful compliance. The public, exhausted by the trauma of chemical upheaval and yearning desperately for refuge from life's relentless demands, were susceptible. The promise was always simple: take this draft and let the burden of consciousness lift. It was a devastating cycle. Early medicine promised cure. In this era, it often delivered managed pacification. Sleep aids became synonymous not with natural restorative rest, but with regulated participation. Sleep now meant acknowledging the authority that dictated how deeply and under what conditions you were allowed to dream. The very act of unconsciousness was rendered conditional. The deep consequence left behind by the episode of poisoned peace was systemic weariness. A pervasive exhaustion settled over the populace, and particularly the governing class. The energy required for radical questioning, for true dissent, was unsustainable when pharmaceutical comfort was available. And so a fragile societal compromise was reached, one that ensured stability at the profound cost of intellectual sovereignty. The black market thrived in this interstitial space, the gap between regulated medicine and outright toxicity. It catered to those who refused the official palliative sedation, the souls needing genuine rest, but rejecting the corporate or state-sanctioned means of achieving it. These illicit chemists continued their deadly trade, selling a perilous freedom from compliance to desperate hearts across the kingdom's forgotten underways. The enduring lesson was stark, that the human desire for absolute rest is perhaps its most dangerous vulnerability. It opens a door not merely into sleep, but into the hands of those who hold the perfect sedative. And while the grand, visible poisoning had ceased, the shadow remained, the subtle implication that wakefulness itself might require payment, and that true freedom required an unsustainable level of relentless vigilance against the seductive chemistry